Welcome to Muddy's Whitetail 101. We're heading into the last week of October now, and this is that time frame when I start hunting mornings and evenings. Prior to this, I've always felt like the mornings were too much of a high risk, low reward proposition to make it sensible. I mean, you can go in and spook a lot of deer in the mornings if you're not careful, because you have to hunt close to where the deer bed. They get there so late or so early in the mornings rather, during the early season, that you have to try to beat them there, and then after the morning hunt you got to get out, and like I said, it can be a real mess. So I try to avoid morning hunting outside of the rut. But now we're rolling into that time frame when the bucks are starting to be on their feet a little bit more in the mornings than what they've been this whole season so far. So it's time to start changing tactics now. Change the way you think about where you hunt, a little bit about time frame. Obviously, morning hunting, you always want to be someplace that the deer is moving toward, not where the deer is. Because if you go where the deer is, you're going to bump them. So you always want to be one step ahead. In the mornings, the bucks are going to be heading back to their beds eventually. They still aren't, completely on the roam like they will be in November, but it's going to take them a little bit longer to get there. They're going to poke around a little bit. Maybe they're going to freshen a few scrapes here and there, check out a couple places where does bed, which means that those travel funnels between bedding areas start to make sense now. Prior to this time frame, those areas would be dead. The bucks would already be in their beds, either standing in those areas browsing or actually bedded down by daylight. Now they're going to be lingering just a little bit longer in the fields, drifting their way back. So look for creek crossings, places where deer go around a ditch, open gates or low spots in fences, places between 2 blocks of cover, even little bands of narrow brush, brushy fence lines, where a buck that's just maybe out there just a little bit extra time that morning is working his way back through to get to his bed. Those are the places you're going to catch them during the last week of October. You're not going to see full-blown rutting activity like you're going to see in another week or two. We'll talk about that when we get to that time frame. But you will start to see these bucks on their feet just a little bit more in the morning, so let's start taking advantage of that. I always figure October 25th, for everybody it can be plus or minus a few days, but October 25th is my start date for morning hunting. So that's right now. I mean, we're on top of it. Talk about one more thing real quick. I was going to go into maybe a discussion of one of Muddy's products, but I'm going to jump to a different subject that I find to be very interesting. I've been using the Muddy trail cameras to pattern some of the bucks on our farm this year, and I've been bringing you along on that process here on Whitetail 101. And this past week, I ended up killing the #1 buck on my target list. It was a deer that we had nicknamed Lefty. And we went through this whole process, and you have to go back through the Whitetail 101 episodes to watch it all, of how we pattern deer and so forth. And I felt like after I killed this deer that I'd really done something special, that here was a buck that I'd pinned down, and found the edges of his range and sort of scoped him out. Then I just got a call from my neighbor this morning, and he said, "Oh yeah, that deer's been daylight active over on our farm half a mile away for the last 2 weeks." So sometimes it's the buck's personality that makes him killable, and sometimes you do put the pieces of the puzzle together and you make it work. But in this case, I just think that I was living in an area, or I was hunting in an area where this deer was living. And he was spending a fair amount of time on his feet throughout his range. So though I didn't maybe have him narrowed right down, I did use those cameras to figure out that I was in his range at least. I just didn't realize that his range was a lot bigger than I thought. And this brings up the subject that like I mentioned, that I was most interested in, and that is the differences in bucks' personalities. And I'm going to touch on it a little bit this week, and I'm going to come back to it a lot more next week, because it's such a fascinating subject of how different bucks of the same age can have whole different behavioral characteristics. I mean, I've got a buck right now I'm hunting, or potentially going to be hunting, that we call the tight rack 10. He's only showing up at night, and we got a pretty good idea where he's living, and we've been moving cameras around trying to figure out, okay, where can we get daylight pictures of this buck? We're not getting any. I mean, here's a buck that's 5 years old that just doesn't seem like he's ever on his feet during the day. And then you contrast that with the buck that I just killed, and he was a 5-year-old buck. It seemed like he was on his feet over a very large area. Tight rack 10, small range, mostly nocturnal. Lefty, big range, daylight active. They're both 5-year-old bucks. So keep that in mind when you're working on putting together your strategies for the deer that you're hunting. Don't assume anything. You always want to start with a blank slate on every buck and learn everything you can about that deer as an individual before you start coming up with a plan for hunting him. And we'll talk about that some more next week. Like I said, it's such a cool subject, and I keep learning more and more about it every year. Well, I appreciate you joining me this week, and I'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Muddy's Whitetail 101.